Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Roman, and I am the director of the Middle East Forum. Today, we welcome you for a special update regarding the situation on Israel. We are joined by Israel advisor Ashley Perry, your regular guest speaker during this 3 o'clock slot, Naveh Dromi, the director of MEF's Israel office, and Yossi Kuperwasser, the former head of Israel's Defense Force Military Intelligence Research Division and a project manager at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I had the privilege of working with Yossi when he was the Director General of the Ministry for Strategic Affairs. Without further ado, General Kuperwasser, if you'll please share with us for 10 minutes the situation going on the ground in Israel.
Well, yes, I'll try in 10 minutes. It's a very complicated situation. We are in the middle of a war, and I would call it, they call it an operation, but actually it's a war, and a very complicated war that's being waged in 2 fronts simultaneously, and maybe 2.5. First, it's the rocket attacks coming from Gaza, mainly by Hamas, but also by the Islamic Jihad. We all understand that the main reason behind it is that Hamas felt a little bit frustrated when Abu Mazen decided to postpone the elections to the Palestinian parliament, which they were supposed to win. And they now look for other ways to show themselves as the leaders of the Palestinian political arena. And by instigating some unrest in Jerusalem and Temple Mount in the last days of Ramadan, they created a slogan chanted by the people in the Temple Mount for Muhammad Deif to strike Tel Aviv with rockets. And of course, when they responded from Gaza, they had a golden opportunity to justify it by the situation in Jerusalem, which is nonsense. But still, they used it in order to launch this attack. And we are now in the 3rd day of this round of exchange between us and the Hamas. Hamas has employed a system in which it can launch, not only Hamas, by the way, Islamic Jihad is also in this story. They employed a system in which they can launch many rockets simultaneously, salvos of hundreds of rockets, up to 150 that we saw the biggest one. And they are very proud of that. And they thought that this is going to challenge the Iron Dome and cause a lot of damage in Israel. It did not, although we did have a problem with the Iron Dome for a short period of time. The Iron Dome battery that was defending Ashkelon was not functioning for a short period of time. But thereafter, the Iron Dome is functioning, but and it managed to thwart many of the attacks. Unfortunately, the Iron Dome has a success ratio of something about 90%, which means that if you launch 150 rockets simultaneously, 15 of them will somehow manage to reach their target. Or let's say that 50 of them are not going to be handled by the Iron Dome in the first place, because Iron Dome doesn't handle rockets that are going to hit open areas, but still out of the 100 that do, that may reach populated areas, the Iron Dome will miss about 10. So we have some casualties, unfortunately. Already, I think something like 6 or so from the rockets. And at the same time, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are trying to hit targets around the Gaza Strip with anti-tank missiles. So today they managed to hit army vehicle and cause the death of one of the soldiers there. And the others are in very problematic conditions. So this is another way that they are doing this business. Now, from their point of view, their main strategic goal has nothing to do with Israel. They want to kill as many Israelis as they can, of course, but it's not between us and them, this war. The war is between them and Fatah. And they want to gain strategically in the Palestinian arena, and at the same time, if they can, reach the goal that was for which they were running in the elections, which is on the one hand to win, but on the other hand is to gain legitimacy. So what they are looking for is legitimacy, international legitimacy for their position as the leading force inside the Palestinian community. And these are things that they cannot extract directly from Israel. What they can get from Israel is a show of their strengths and a show of how much damage they can cause to Israel and how they can disrupt the ordinary life in Israel, which they, of course, can with their rockets, because even if we have the Iron Dome, since it's not a foolproof, and since we want to care, since we care a lot about the safety of our population, we have to stop the classes in areas that are under threat, which is almost all of Israel at this point. And this is something that affects our ordinary life, and they are very proud of these achievements. On the other hand, I think that they knew right from the beginning that it's going to come with a price. And the question was how big this price is going to be. The first thing that that happened was that Israel gave them some sort of a safety net by saying, "Oh, listen, we are very upset, and we are going to hit you hard, but don't worry, we are not going to try to change the basic situation in Gaza. We are not going to force you out of office, out of controlling the Gaza Strip. And our goal now is to restore deterrence. It's not to change the government in Gaza. As long as this is the case, the opening position for Hamas is relatively good, because whatever price they're going to pay, it is repairable. It may take a long time, but they don't care. It is repairable. And as long as the strategic asset of controlling Gaza is not under threat, they can stick to this policy of exchanging fire with Israel, launching rockets towards Israel for some time, whatever time they need, in order not to be shown as if they gave up too early, and gain the strategic effect that I was referring to before. But the problem is that I don't think they realize that the price is going to be that big, that's significant. Because if you look back at 2014, for example, the point at which we started destroying buildings in Gaza was only somewhere towards the 50th day. Here, we started to do it on day 2. And the houses that we take care of are the headquarters of Hamas, that serve also as a basis for producing arms and running the business, running the intelligence efforts, and so on and so forth. And they suffered quite a heavy loss in this respect. So I'd say that on the second day, or beginning on the late on day 2, and definitely today, the balance is shifting towards or against Hamas, and the payments that they are paying for any extension of this round is growing. Today, they lost some of their major operatives when it comes to producing arms. The entire leadership of the arms producing arm of Hamas was eliminated. The day before, some of the key figures in the Islamic Jihad lost their lives, and many other infrastructure facilities and assets that Hamas has are being hit by the Israeli Air Force. And it's clearly the price is very heavy and felt, but Hamas is not yet in a position where it has to ask for a ceasefire or show readiness to accept a ceasefire. Neither is Israel, which, as the balance is shifting towards Israel and against Hamas, has an interest in charging an even heavier price, so that Hamas will eventually say, well, maybe it was not such a good idea to start this thing altogether. We all remember that this was what Nasrallah said after the Second Lebanese War, when he said, had I known that this is what Israel is going to do, especially regarding the Dahia, I wouldn't have started it in the first place. And Hamas is getting there by every passing hour. It still has, of course, the capability, just like Hezbollah had at that time, to keep launching rockets. And big salvos are still coming and will come. But the price that they are charged is getting bigger by the hour. This is what's happening with this in this story. We are still not in a position to change the directive. We are not going to say, okay, so if this goes on, we shall destroy Hamas. This is not yet in the cards. so we can Hamas can go on with it for a while. What happened? The other front that we are involved in is the domestic front, with everything that's happening with the Arab society in Israel, that took to the streets in a very violent manner. It's all over the place. It's all over Israel. There are two cores of this activity, one in Acre and one in Lod, where the situation went out of control, and we had to declare curfew and bring in special forces from the police to take care of the situation. And we have, as you saw in the video that you showed before, we have one Jewish person very severely, critically hurt in Acre, and the situation is very dire, very dire. And it's first of all, it's a matter of security, so security of the Jewish population in these mixed towns that is under threat. And secondly, it's a matter of the future of the relations between us, Jewish Israelis, and the Arab Israelis. So of course, not all Arabs participate in those riots, and most of them don't. But there are enough people inside the Arab communities that are taking part in these riots. And worst of that, the leadership of the Arab community, especially the members of Knesset, don't speak against it, with one exception of somebody who's not a member of neither the Arab Joint List and neither the Arab United List, but a member of Meretz, Isawi Frej, who came out against it. The others are either in favor or silent. And this is something that's going to have a very bitter impact on the issues between us and the Arab society. All the idea of integration suffered a very heavy blow. And I don't know how we are going to recover from that. It seems to me that people don't understand that the Arabs in Israel share the same basic opinion like Hamas and like Fatah, which is that they don't accept the justification for the existence of a Jewish state in Israel, in Palestine as they call it. They think this should disappear. They may be more patient when it comes to how much time it's going to take before this happens and what happens until it takes place. But they still also believe that there is no justification for having a Jewish state here. And with Hamas calling them and instigating them to take to the streets and do something about it, some of them, especially those who are members of the Israeli Hamas, which is the northern northern part of the Muslim movement, under Sheikh Raed Salah, who is very well known for his way of dispatching this libel about Al-Aqsa, that Israel wants to destroy Al-Aqsa and also all of that, and was arrested several times for all kinds of incitement and other stuff. These people went out to the street and carried out those terrible attacks that you see on the video here, some of those. But I want to emphasize, it's not only there, it's all over the state. It's in the south, in the Negev, on the main streets. It's in Road 6, the main axis from north to south. It's on many other roads that go next to Arab villages and towns. It's all over Israel. It's an unbearable situation, and we have to take some special measures in order to handle it. There was a declaration about a special emergency situation inside Israel in some places, especially in Lod. Now they're probably going to extend it to some other places, and it's a crazy situation. And lastly, as I said, there's a half front, which is in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. It used to be the main front in the beginning. Now it's relatively calm, but you may never know. It can erupt again. And when it was hot, it was made of several disputes that were happening simultaneously, and was a very sensitive and strange time situation when everything happened at the same time. Yom Yerushalayim, the day of Jerusalem, Laylat el-Qadr, the holiest day of the Ramadan, when the Quran started to be coming from heaven. All of these things happened at the same time, And this was used or abused by Hamas in order to justify their launching of rockets. And the rest is what I told you right now. And I think it was about a little bit more than 10 minutes.
General Kuperwasser, it was an excellent presentation, and I hope you'll stay with us until we get to our question and answer time. And for those who are joining us from home, you should be able to type your question into the moderator box at the bottom of your screen. Joining us next for an assessment of the political reaction to the situation in Israel is Ashley Perry, Israel's advisor for the Middle East Forum.
Thank you, Greg. As usual, when I was asked to to write a sort of title of what we're going to talk about, it was politics. It was Saturday night, and the only issue was whether there'd be a government or not. And it certainly seemed like they were expecting even to sworn in a government, maybe even by today. But obviously, a series of events, as Yossi laid out, have led to where we are today. So I'm going to deal a little bit with the diplomatic and a little bit of the internal political. First of all, how did we get here? As many of you know, especially from the international media, this supposedly started with what was essentially a property dispute in an area of East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah or Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood, with property that belonged to Jews before 1948, and they were ethnically cleansed from the region. And the property was then given by the Jordanians to some Arab families who never gained title or property over it, ownership over it. And then I believe it was in the 70s, the Jewish owners, basically started court proceedings to try and get it back. And in the end, the court tried to push for a compromise, which was that the Arab families would then pay rent and agree that this was owned by the family that it was owned by. And that went well for a while. They paid rent, everything was fine. And then because of pressure, perhaps because of incitement, whatever it was, they decided to stop paying rent. They broke the agreement. They started building on the property again as a tenant, something's not allowed. So the Jewish owners decided to take this back through the court system. And no decision had been, lower courts had decided, and it was winging its way through to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the way this was portrayed around the world was that Israel was Judaizing, whatever that means, parts of Jerusalem. No, this was a property dispute that was jumped on by extremist factions and sold around the world as an attempt to ethnically cleanse. So that's where we started, and that's where, whenever we have a conflict, we talk about clocks here. We talk about the diplomatic clock, we talk about the political clock, we talk about the military clock. The diplomatic clock started then because there started to be pressure. We heard all these press releases and communiques and statements about Israel should restrain this settlement building and all these other basically, factors that weren't true. Then we had the very important nights in Ramadan where Palestinians, went up to the Temple Mount to Al-Aqsa to pray, and they basically attacked police and tried to attack Jewish worshippers at the Kotel below. Again, this was portrayed around the world as Israeli police beating up innocent Palestinian worshippers. So that added another layer of it. And you can imagine around the Arab world, this didn't play out very well. We even heard some of our new good friends from the UAE, Bahrain, and other places condemning what was their perception of events. This managed to prevent what is an annual event, the Jerusalem Flag Parade, which is an event where basically mostly youths carrying Israeli flags dance through the streets and enter the old city, and then meet at the Kotel, where there's tens of thousands of people dancing. Because of the threats from Hamas to shoot rockets, this was basically cancelled. Hamas understood this as a victory. And because of this, they were emboldened. Also, because of the chants that Yossi talked about, the chants from the worshippers on the Temple Mount, Dev, Mohammed Dev, blast Tel Aviv, launch your rockets against Tel Aviv. And there are some who speculate perhaps this got to his head, and he thought that the military command of Hamas thought that they could get away with a short, protracted, a relatively small conflict where they could look like the defenders of Jerusalem, the ones who managed to scare away the flag parade and other things, but they didn't count on the response of Israel. What we are seeing now in the international community is the start of the slowing down of the clock. What I mean by that is, for the first few days, regardless of statements, there was no great interest to stop Israel. And that's usually what happens. Obviously, there's very little influence on Hamas other than some of the players in the region, but the international players basically are already starting to gather around Israel. And we see the Assistant Deputy Secretary of State, Hadi Amar, who's coming to the region. He'll certainly try and put a certain amount of pressure on Israel. He's meeting with Palestinian leaders as well. We see the EU envoy. We see, for some reason, the resurrection of the quartet, if anyone even remembers who the quartet are, but suddenly the quartet have woken up and are getting involved. We see Russia, we see China. Basically, there seems to be the diplomatic pressure that's just started, but certainly what we'll see in the next few days, depending on the pictures that some of these populations are seeing and some of these leaders are seeing, whether there's an uptick in Palestinian children who are dying, doesn't matter how they're dying, doesn't matter if it's a Hamas misfire or an accident by an Israeli attack on Hamas. The fact is that these are the sort of pressure points which affect the international community's view on this, and there'll certainly be more pressure. Also, the site, as Yossi said, usually this happens weeks into a conflict, but the sites of demolishing tall buildings, even though these are Hamas infrastructures, they are where they live, they're where they work, they're where they plan, strategy and everything else, certainly is not something that works well on the international screens. And Hamas have a very sophisticated propaganda network, and they'll make sure that every single thing that they think will work in their favor on the propaganda front will be shown around the world. So there's certainly that to be looked at. As I said, the pressure has only just started. So far, there are calls to stop, to ramp down, to de-escalate, etc., but nothing more than a UN Security Council meeting, which happens pretty much rote anyway and doesn't really achieve much. But when we see diplomats start gathering, start putting pressure on the Israeli government, that's when we'll really be able to tell how much pressure this Israeli government can resist. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said today, reportedly, that this is going to take at least another week. Apparently, the IDF have many other targets that they want to get to, and that's perhaps why they're going, quite early after some of the big leaders, some of these buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Yossi would obviously be able to talk to this better than I, but how much Hamas can keep up this rate of rocket fire? I've heard speculation, everything from a few days to a week. So maybe they have to ramp it down over the next couple of days. But the next couple of days will be extremely, extremely telling. Internally, it's very interesting, as Yossi started to mention, what I think has happened here, which is unprecedented, at least in a while, is that this conflict has spilled over into Israel itself. What we've seen on the streets of Lod, in Acre, Akko, is really unprecedented. The other day, we saw hundreds, if not thousands of Arabs marching through Jewish neighborhoods in Lod. Lod is a mixed town or city, and we saw thousands marching through the streets with Palestinian flags, looking to lynch any Israeli Jew they could find, burning Israeli flags, burning cars, burning synagogues and schools, etc. And this is pretty unprecedented. We've seen this really spread to other places. And in Acre, as Yossi laid out, they lynched an Israeli Jew who is apparently in a very bad situation. They set fire to his car. There's been quite a few other attempted lynchings. We see vigilante groups on the other side, Jewish vigilante groups in places like Tiberia, and Bat Yam, smashing Arab-owned shops and looking to what they claim as defend Jewish interests. What this means politically is really remarkable, because again, if we were talking a few days ago, we were talking about perhaps an unprecedented event where an Arab party for the first time in the history of the state of Israel would either be in the government or at least become a powerful supporting voice outside. There are those who say, well, that's it. There is no way that any government especially one where, it's supported at least by a significant number of right and center parties, could ever go back to such a thing. What we are seeing is ongoing talks, because people like Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, who are trying to form the next government, their view is we shouldn't let Hamas dictate the terms of whether we form a government or not. And we have to also look at that clock. And at the end of the day, we see that Yair Lapid only has 21 days left. And we know that according to the Israeli basic laws, he's not allowed to ask for extension. So it's a hard 21 days. So before this violence, what we knew and what we were hearing is a government was almost signed. We saw the distribution of portfolios. We saw perhaps many of the outstanding issues being dealt with. There were still some outstanding issues, but on the whole, many of them had been dealt with. And there was an expectation at some point by the end of the week, we could have almost had a government. Now that's certainly going to be put off, because there's no way this can happen while Israel is fighting essentially a war. And, not just in Gaza, but also really on the home front around the country. And there's no way that Naftali Bennett, certainly as the most right-wing element of a future so-called unity or change government, can be seen as relying on the Islamist party, even though, just to correct Yossi, the leader of Ram, Mansour Abbas, actually has come out with a few statements. They're probably not what we would certainly like, but they're much further in this type of situation than any other Arab leader would go. He has called for restraint, he has called for calm. He hasn't come out with the usual Arab party line of, this is all about the occupation and these are our martyrs, et cetera, which some Arab leaders we have heard saying. So he's obviously thinking that there can still be something for him after. The other option is, if Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett and others aren't able to put together a government in 21 days, we know it then goes back to the Knesset, and there's little chance that there'll be 61 members of Knesset who can come together to form a government. So I think we're pretty much, if there is no government by the end of 21 days, I think we are looking at a fifth election. But with all the security issues, the diplomatic issues, don't forget coronavirus is still around. So there's a lot to be seen in the next few days, and certainly everything is affected. The diplomatic front, the political front, the internal security front is all going to have a massive effect on these negotiations when and if they take place again.
Ashley, thank you very much for your input, and we're going to hopefully have you stick around for questions after Naveh Dromi, the director of the Middle East Forum's Israel Victory Project and Israel office, gives us a brief overview of what's being talked about in the media and just how the Israeli people are reacting to this situation. If Naveh is there.
I'm here.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Thank you, Naveh.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for hosting this event in this evening. If you were talking to me yesterday, like Greg did, on this hour, you would find me in the shelter with my with my two daughters. This evening was silent than yesterday in the center of Israel, but as Yossi mentioned, and also Ashley, for a long time we didn't have rockets in the center of Israel. But I will take it to the civilian point of view from the Israeli side. I think I will be happy to hear what Yossi thinks about it. I think the Israeli society is very strong. I think that if the government, the army will decide to take this operation much further for another week or two, then the Israeli society will support them, especially in the south of Israel, where they are tired from flying balloons that they're burning their fields. And what's really interesting in this situation is not, I think from the civilian point of view, it's more interesting what Yossi and Ashley spoke about, which what's going on with the Arab society in Israel. But when it comes to the conflict with Hamas. The society in Israel is very strong. They will handle, I think, every operation, even though their leaders might not believe in them the same way. What's happening when it comes, Ashley spoke about it, about diplomacy and the pressure on Israel. Then what we see is that in many other ways, they're trying to put a pressure on Israel by, for example, saying that, for example, 40 Palestinians got killed, 10 of them are kids. Now, they won't say that those 10 kids were killed because some of the rockets are falling inside Gaza and killing their own people. This is something that from our point of view, when we are trying to improve our image, we are trying to spread this message. We are not sure it's working, but it's something that Israel tries to do. The biggest challenge here is what we do the day after. And I think that the day after something has to change. It can't end in the same way it began. I will say something I think Yossi won't agree with, but if we're checking it back a few days ago, what started in Al-Aqsa in Temple Mount is that the Arabs couldn't accept the fact that Jerusalem, that we celebrate Jerusalem Day, that we have the March of the Flags. And this is something that happens because Israel is not showing enough sovereignty in some of its places, for example, Temple Mount or other places. If Israel, in the day after this operation, will be more assertive about its sovereignty, about what belongs to it, then I think it might make a difference. I doubt that things will look different on Temple Mount. I will say for a case, not everyone are familiar with that, but today on Temple Mount, which is the most sacred place for Jews, Jews are not allowed to pray. Jews are not allowed to drink from the water. I'm not sure how to say it. And this is something that the Arabs are fighting for. And if we want things to change in Israeli society with the Arabs and in front of Hamas, I think that the day after it will have to change first there. And then when it comes to our relationships with the Arabs, it will have to change in the way that we look at them. Because in Israel, unfortunately, some of us, also among the politicians and the Arab politicians, they look at the Israeli Arabs as a population that we need to feel sorry for, that we need to take care of them. Israeli Arabs get benefits when they want to go to university. And I think in Israel, we have to realize that we can look at the Israeli Arabs as citizens, that they have duties also as Jews have. And this will change the way things look inside mixed Israel cities. When it comes to civilian rights and civilian duties, they have to be just like us. It's not possible that in the Negev, for example, the Bedouins are stealing weapons from an army base, from training of the army, and the court released them. It's not possible that they steal weapon and soldiers can shoot back. But this is what happens. And I think that if Israel will win this operation, it will win also these small battles that happens with Gaza, but also inside Israel. I hope I gave you another point of view on this operation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Okay, now we're going to go back to our full panel, and we'll be joined by General Kuperwasser, Naveh Dromi, and Ashley Perry. Our first question from the audience comes from Carrie Hillebrand. I think this might be best for Ashley and for Yossi. Can you address what are the reactions with the governmental and the man in the street in the countries that joined into the Abraham Accords, especially the UAE? Actually, I know you touched on this. Can you elaborate?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, I think, when it was, about the Temple Mount, it was about Al-Aqsa Mosque, then there was probably a feeling that Arab countries have to at least come out and make their statement known. These are not countries which necessarily are great lovers of Hamas, even though, so they have had these, sort of tenuous relationships with Hamas leaders in the past. Certainly that the fact that there hasn't been anything really strong, I think shows that the relationships are going to be much, much stronger than this particular round of fighting. But I think, again, depending on where we are with the diplomatic clock, depending how much goes on, depending what kind of images and numbers that we see, unfortunately, there is that sort of limit. It's crass to talk about it, but there are certain limits of how many kids, how many people wounded, how, what age, and all that sort of thing. That really depends on what Israel will see from the diplomatic arena. But I do believe that our relationships with these countries, these new countries, especially the UAE and Bahrain, will survive this because, as I've said many times in our weekly webinars, our joint enemy is still Iran. And everyone will keep their eye on the ball, and they know that this round will end at some point relatively soon, whether it's days or weeks, but Iran will remain a real problem. Even now we're seeing what Iran is doing in the region. So that will not change. So I think the relationships will not change regardless of some pressure and some communiques and press releases.
Moving to the topic of Iran, and this question is for Yossi. Yossi, do you think that Iran is a puppet master? Are they testing Iron Dome's ability to deal with a large barrage of rockets over a short time period? And to follow up on that, how much damage can be done to Gaza without a land invasion, relying on Iron Dome, airstrikes, and artillery?
Okay, yes. Iran is definitely involved in everything Hamas is doing, very close ties, especially when it comes to the research and development of arms and the supply of arms and the use of arms, the planning of the use of arms. In all these matters, Iranian experts are deeply involved. And I'm sure they were involved also in the planning of this terror campaign that Hamas did. Beyond that, Iran is very much in favor of continuing it in starting it and in continuing it, because we saw the messages coming from Iran, encouraging Hamas to continue, and also promising it more money. And definitely this is what the Iranians expect Hamas to do. Fortunately, as I said, the Hamas key figures in the effort to develop these capabilities lost their lives during this during the Israeli attacks, and this is if you add that to all kinds of problems that the Iranians had recently, it's definitely painful for them. What was the second question? Can we get rid of all the launchers?
Not just the launchers, but how much damage can be done without a land invasion? What can be done to address issues beyond the launchers?
All the infrastructure of Hamas is vulnerable. We can reach it. I don't know if we have the information, if we have the targets, all the information, all the targets that we want, but definitely we have a lot, and at the same time, I can say that there are probably some things that we just don't know where they are. I don't believe that we know everything where it is, but we can inflict very heavy damage on the military infrastructure of Hamas, and we saw it in the couple of days that this operation went on. Israel attacked about 1,000 targets. Each one of them has some contribution to the capabilities of Hamas militarily. So, and this is only 2 days, and everybody could have seen the army coming with the plan for the coming days to the cabinet today. So it's they have more targets, and they will develop targets also during the operation. At one point, the targets are going to run out. And it's not that the Israeli military is running out of targets, it's the Hamas that is running out of assets. But whether that would mean that everything is going to disappear, I guess no, because there are some probably things that we don't know of, and whether they can recuperate from that situation and reconstruct much of it, they can. It's going to take a long time. And when you speak about restoring deterrence, that's what we want to bring them to a position where they need a long time to reconstruct what they had in the past. Some of it is irreversible, but most of it probably is. And I hope that the Egyptians will do whatever they can, to prevent them, the Hamas, from bringing in all kinds of material they need, to rebuild their capabilities in the future. Much depends on their commitment to doing that. And when it comes finally to the first question, I agree fully with everything Ashley said. I think that strategically speaking, the commitment of UAE and Bahrain, even Morocco, was put in challenge intentionally by Hamas. They believe that by raising the Jerusalem issue and by fighting against Israel, they will put the UAE and Bahrain in an impossible situation, and they will be able to harm the cooperation between them and Israel. And yes, on the issue of Jerusalem, as Ashley said, there were some statements coming from Bahrain and the Emirates that were expected in Israel. I don't think that they surprised anybody. And that reflected the fact that they are not Zionists and they do not support Israel more than the Palestinians. But on the strategic level, I think they remain committed to the agreements. It's in their best interests, and they don't want to be toyed by Hamas. They know what they want, and they will stick to these agreements.
Thank you, Yossi. This question is for Naveh Dromi. Naveh, regarding the events that took place in Lod with the lynching attempt last night, and now spreading to Bat Yam, Haifa, Akko, and other mixed Jewish Arab cities, and more of Bat Yam on the border between Jaffa and that city. What is the Israeli government going to do? You spoke about the need to maybe increase police regulation around army bases, but in the near term, in the immediate future, what will Israel do to ensure that it reduces friction between Jews and Arabs in mixed and shared Israeli cities?
It's a good question, and to be honest, I don't know. I was sure that this evening was going to be easier and much calmer, but it doesn't seem this way. We have one Jewish, which is now in hospital trying to save his life after a lynch. We have an Arab after a lynch by Jews in Bat Yam. It seems like, unfortunately, the government just doesn't take control over the situation. I think that what can be done in the long run after these events are over, I think what has to be done is that, as I said before, we need to make sure that the answer is complicated. First, we have to make sure there is a distance in the identity between Israeli Arabs and the Palestinians. Some of the Israeli Arabs are identifying with the Palestinians due to Israeli left organizations that are promoting this identity, promoting these pro-Palestinians feelings. I think this is something that happens more among the youth of the Israeli Arabs. If you ask their parents, I think their parents are at home right now, losing control over their children. And Israel, the way it can somehow disconnect the connection between those Israeli Arabs to the Palestinian narrative is to defeat Hamas. This is the way I see it. Once you defeat the Palestinian narrative, then you can disconnect this connection. So this is one thing that we can do in this area. When it comes to life in Israel,
I want to really quickly just take that one point and move the Yossi for one quick second. Just in terms of the immediate issue, Yossi, the last time that there was military rule over a Israeli domestic city center was 1966, when the emergency regulations from 48 were lifted. What is the Army's plan? What is the border police's plan to make sure these riots are stamped out?
I think the best way to handle it is to, first of all, really have a lot of police in the streets, and that's what we are doing right now. We call the reserves of the police and bring them, and we take some of the police or the border police from the West Bank and bring them over to the heated areas inside Israel. And once you have more police over there, there's a better chance that order will be reached and observed. That's, the second thing is that we have to do something about the leadership. I can tell you that, for example, there are some mayors that came out against the riots with joint statements together with Jewish mayors that live next, that have preside over cities nearby. These are the kind of initiatives. It has to come from the leadership. You cannot just rely on power, because this cannot last forever. And this is what needs to be done. And I agree also with Naveh, even though she thought that I'm going to be against it, that the rule of law should prevail all over the place. And this calls for a change in culture, because Arab society in Israel is not accepting the rule of law in general, not only in the context of confronting Israel. It's when it comes to criminal activity, when it comes to, they don't look at the police as the place to go for if there is a problem. They solve the problems in a different way. And this is something that has to be taken care of immediately, and these cultural changes to take place immediately. And all these measures together can, in my mind, have some impact, because at the end of the day, many people understand that something is wrong in this picture. This cannot last forever. And I think that, I hope it's going to be mitigated, at least for time.
Thank you, Yossi. I do want to kind of reach out back to Naveh, but first on the Israeli political side and also on the general street side. But first, if we can address this from the political angle. Ashley, one of our viewers has asked, is this the death knell of the idea of bringing the Arab parties, or an Arab party, specifically Mansour Abbas, into a coalition government? And if it is, what's the opportunity for a national unity government as a result of this new conflict?
I'd just like to take that even a step back. And sometimes in situations, you have to always look at whose interests are served by a particular situation, not necessarily whether they led it, but whose interests. And I think, again, if you look at Arab society in the last year or so, there's been a movement towards the Israeli Jewish majority, with Ram, with other elements. And what we've seen is the Joint Arab List, which basically was, up until recently, the only voice of Arab society, was basically mostly involved with the Palestinian issue, as Naveh talked about. That was their issue, that was their rallying call. But what we see over the last year, because of growing violence, mostly internal in Arab towns and cities, we saw that the vast majority, according to every survey that I saw, the issue which really vexed them the most was security, policing. They wanted to stop the sort of gang violence. And this is something that very much Ram said, if we're inside, not necessarily the government, but inside the center of Israeli politics, if we're there to be part of the decision-making process, we can get greater budgets for this. And we saw that even Mansour Abbas was given the Knesset committee in charge of the Negev, which, Naveh's point is sort of a little bit absurd, considering what's going on there. But we definitely saw that they were moving away from the Palestinian issue. This was more internal. They wanted other issues. So now with the violence, it's certainly been able to reframe it back towards the joint list, which is the more extreme party in Israeli politics, and certainly they gain from it. And they can go to Ram supporters again, especially if there is a fifth election, and say, look what your guy did. He wanted to try and join the Zionists, and look what they did to us. Look what they're doing to us. They don't want peace with us. We have to go back to our hardline position. So there's certainly a lot of factors that are being played in. Whether this affects a unity government, Ram will almost certainly not be in the government. What they're hoping, the so-called unity or change bloc, is that they will support them from the outside, because to form a government, you just need a majority. The change bloc without Ram is 58. With Ram on the outside voting either in favor or abstaining, the opposite bloc will not be able to have the necessary numbers to be able to block it. So that's something which is very much being worked on. It certainly complicates everything. Naftali Bennett openly met with Mansour Abbas, proudly, or not so proudly, whatever you want to say, put out communiques, even put out pictures, of the other parties as well. It's going to be a lot more difficult, especially someone like Naftali Bennett. But considering what he's doing, I think there is a strong chance of still being able to scoop something out, because Naftali Bennett probably knows that at this point, he's not going to make it to the next Knesset. Only about a quarter of his voters, and don't forget he's only on 6 seats, approve of what he's doing. He's being attacked incessantly by Likud, incessantly by the Religious Zionist Party, which is demonstrating outside the houses of all the Yamina members, even during this conflict. So I think Naftali Bennett knows that this is his one chance of remaining on the map for now. If they do go to elections, he's basically going to be wiped out. So I think that there's still enough interest there from many of the major players to still try and cobble something together. But if the conflict goes on for another 21 days, that's going to be almost impossible to form a government, but the likelihood is it won't. So we'll just have to see what the attitude is after and what the feeling is. And don't forget, I'm sure all the politicians are constantly polling within their own party base and wider society. So that will play into it. But I think there's still, from what I'm hearing, from what I'm seeing, there's still a great interest to form this so-called unity and change government.
So we've talked about the politicians, but let's focus on the voters for a second. Naveh, what's the reaction in terms of how the two supporting entities, or the blocks of citizens that would support the Likud-led bloc or the Gush Shinui, the change bloc, what are they saying now? Ashley gave us an analysis of the situation regarding Bennett's party, Yamina. What are other political parties saying as it relates to the action they want to see related to this new conflict?
It's a complicated question. To be honest, I don't think that this conflict somehow affects the other parties. If I look at Gideon Sa'ar party, for example, New Hope, Tikva Hadasha, I don't see how this conflict somehow affects him to change his mind and to agree to sit with Netanyahu. I think this is the one principle that Gideon Sa'ar is really will not change in any way. When it comes to other parties from the left, like Meretz, Avoda, Labor, and the Yesh Atid, I don't see how they sit with Netanyahu. I do think that if Yair Lapid mandate goes back to the Knesset, there is a chance to get 61, because I believe that Naftali Bennett wouldn't go, as Ashley said, to 5th elections, because he knows he won't survive them. And then the Likud will get maybe Gantz, or maybe some people from New Hope, because they also know that if they go to 5th elections, they won't survive. So I believe that if it goes back to the Knesset, then there is still a chance to get 61 seats. And also, what's happened, maybe I should correct myself. One party which is interesting in this situation is Chosen Israel, the party of Gantz. Since this conflict began, we see that Netanyahu and Benny Gantz got closed. The security situation put them in an area that allows them, in Hebrew we call it to get off the ladder and sit together. And if Gantz did it before, I don't see a reason he won't do it now. and use the situation to sit with Netanyahu, and then Naftali Bennett will have no choice to join. This is the way I see it, and I think the voters of Gantz will approve it. Because if you remember, Gantz was almost 35 seats last time, right, Ashley? And he is now 8
together with Lapid.
Yeah, together with Lapid. He is now 8 seats, but those 8 seats that voted for him did it even though he sat with Netanyahu. So I think they will peacefully live with him, sitting with Netanyahu again. From the other side, the right-wing parties, Tzionut Datit, and the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, I don't see a way they sit with the left parties.
Okay, thank you, Naveh, for that analysis of the different parties. Yossi, really quick, what's the chance that Hezbollah gets involved in the action?
I think for the time being, the chances are small. They are watching, they reflect on the situation, they encourage Hamas, of course, but this is a Palestinian issue, so let the Palestinians run it. And the situation in Lebanon is so complex and so dire that for them to be seen now as intervening in something that is not theirs and putting Lebanon in danger for that is very strange. But, you know, to get into the head of Nasrallah is not easy.
Ashley, has President Biden spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu? What's the feeling about whether or not Biden will give full support to Israel?
To the best of my knowledge, the highest level is Secretary of State Blinken, who's spoken to Netanyahu. There was a readout of that where Netanyahu thanked him for their support. Early on in this, there were some, let's just say, more problematic statements about moral equivalence between what's going on between Hamas and Israel. In the last few hours, or perhaps the last day, there's been certainly an improvement in that. Secretary of State Blinken has mentioned for the first time that Hamas is actually a terrorist organization and there's no equivalence. Whereas, as I said, some of the, like the White House spokeswoman Psaki and others mentioned this moral equivalence, but Secretary of State Blinken has certainly, basically mentioned the fact that this is a democratic country fighting a terrorist organization, which is far fairer. So we see an understanding at this point in time with the Biden administration. We'll see what happens when the Assistant Secretary arrives in Israel, someone who's not seen as the best, the greatest friend of Israel. If we look at his reputation in the Obama administration and previous administrations, but everything can happen. We could be talking 24 hours. If there's a lot of other people who are being killed, the numbers start to rise. The attitude could change in one day, in 48 hours. So we're still very early on in this. At the moment, Israel has a lot of space, but that can certainly change diplomatically within 24 or 48 hours.
We have 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you to give a 1-minute commentary on what happens in the next 48 hours. Yossi, you on the military. Naveh, you on the streets. Ashley, you in the Knesset. Let's start with Naveh.
On the streets, I think we will see I think we're going to see relaxation, because I think now we are in the top. This is the most terrible situation we can get to, I believe, and maybe I want to believe that from now on, it will somehow get relaxed.
Ashley, what's happening in the political arena?
As I said, the contacts have not stopped. The negotiations are ongoing. There, I would argue, at around 90% finished, but everything will be put off until the conflict is over. So really, it's the security clock that's defining now the political clock.
Yossi, what happens in the security arena?
Well, I think that if the people think rationally, Hamas has little to gain from the continuation, and it has much to lose. And that's why it may start pushing towards some sort of a ceasefire. Israel has a different opinion, but at the same time, you never know if somebody would not be hurt, and it's one bomb can reach hit a place with a lot of people, and God knows what's happening there. So maybe it's also good from the Israeli point of view, rationally speaking, to listen to. And the Americans are coming with an initiative. Hadi Amr is supposed to arrive, and I think that they're going to ask for ceasefire. That's rationally. but people do not work here according to ratio. So it's according to reason. What is going to happen unreasonably is that the exchange is going to continue, and we shall see more salvos, and we shall see more attacks in Gaza. And as I agree with Naveh, Hamas all the time speaks about new surprises that they want to show us. But what can surprise us now? That's the question. And, we sort of okay. We were already surprised, and we are overwhelmed by the huge salvos. Okay, and the 7 rockets to Jerusalem. We've seen that. We understand. Okay, so I don't know what kind of new surprises we should expect.
Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser, Naveh Dromi, and Ashley Perry, thank you for joining the Middle East Forum special webinar this afternoon or evening your time. For more information on the Middle East Forum, you can check out our website at meforum.org or on YouTube at Middle East Forum. Hope everyone has a good afternoon, a good evening, and you join us for a regularly scheduled webinar this Friday. Thank you very much and have a nice day.